Story 1. The thing about working in a haunted house is that you expect people to get scared. That's the whole point. Screams, jumps, even the occasional nervous laugh as someone tries to play off just how freaked out they are. It's all part of the job. But one night went way beyond that, and I'll never forget it. I used to work at this small haunted house in my hometown. It wasn't a big operation, nothing like the massive Halloween attractions you see advertised. We had maybe 100 visitors on a good night, but what we lacked in size we made up for in intensity. The layout was a classic maze-style walkthrough with different themed rooms. Creepy clowns, zombies, a fog-filled cemetery. People loved the strobe lights and mirror maze toward the end. It was the kind of disorienting fun that had people stumbling out, laughing and talking about how clever it was. Or so we thought. That particular night started like any other. The usual rush of people came through after dinner, their faces a mix of excitement and hesitation as they handed over their tickets. We all knew our roles, me as the grim reaper lurking in the shadows, my co-worker playing a screaming ghost who'd leap out when you least expected it. Everyone had their gimmick, their timing perfected after weeks of practice. Then came him. I didn't notice him at first, but later I'd pieced together that he was in one of the later groups. Mid-20s, average height, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. He was with two friends, both joking loudly as they entered, clearly trying to psych themselves up. They didn't look scared, just here for a laugh. Everything was normal as their group moved through the rooms. A scream here, a laugh there, the occasional playful shove between friends. They were fine, totally fine. But when they hit the mirror maze, that's when it happened. I was stationed just outside the maze, watching as groups stumbled in, their expressions turning from amusement to confusion as the mirrors and strobes started messing with their sense of direction. I'd hear the occasional, "Wait, which way is this?" or "Come on, it's over here," followed by laughter as they figured it out. That's how it was supposed to go. Confusion, fun, relief. But this guy, he wasn't laughing. From my spot in the shadows, I could see him freeze about halfway through the maze. His friends had gone ahead, joking and calling for him to catch up, but he didn't move. He was standing still, his face pale, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I stepped back further into the dark, readying for my cue to scare the next group. But before I could even take a step, I heard it, a loud, panicked shout. "Get me out of here!" His voice was desperate, shaky, loud enough to catch the attention of the other groups nearby. Everyone fell quiet, unsure if this was part of the haunted house or something real. The guy started pacing, his movements jerky like he couldn't figure out where to go. The strobes flashed, the mirrors multiplied his reflection, and he spun around in a panic. The next thing I heard was glass shattering. I rushed forward, pushing through the maze to find him. His friends were shouting, telling him to stop, but he wasn't listening. He'd kicked one of the mirrors, hard enough to shatter the glass and send jagged shards flying. Blood was already pooling at his feet, staining the maze's floor under the flashing lights. "Stop! Stop, man!" One of his friends tried to grab him, but he was frantic, his breathing shallow and fast. He kept yelling, half words and incoherent pleas as he stumbled toward another mirror. Before anyone could stop him, he swung his leg again, kicking at the glass like he thought it would open up a way out. This time the shards sliced deep into his calf, and he screamed, a raw, guttural sound that I'll never forget. His friends managed to pull him away from the maze, dragging him toward the exit as he kept shouting, begging to be let out. Blood was dripping down his leg, pooling in the darkened path behind them. I didn't know what to do. None of us did. The haunted house crew froze, unsure whether to chase after them or stay put. We'd seen plenty of panicked guests before, but never like this. By the time we got outside, the paramedics were already there. Someone had called 911 after seeing him stagger out into the parking lot, screaming for help. The ambulance lights painted everything in eerie flashes of red and blue as they loaded him onto a stretcher, his friends standing nearby with pale faces and trembling hands. He was still talking, his voice shaky, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I couldn't get out. I couldn't get out." Turns out he was fine, physically anyway. He needed stitches and a lot of bandages, but his injuries weren't life-threatening. The haunted house covered his medical bills, which were hefty, especially considering the cleanup we had to do inside. Glass repairs, blood-stained floors, and new mirrors, obviously. The whole thing was a mess, but what stuck with me wasn't the chaos of the aftermath. It was his face, his sheer, unfiltered terror as he stood there in the maze. I don't know what he saw in those mirrors, but whatever it was, it broke him, even if just for a moment. Story 2. I was stationed at the graveyard scene that night, fake fog swirling around my feet, a half-broken lantern hanging over my head, and the distant sound of screams echoing down the trail. It was a typical night at the haunted trail we'd set up just outside of town, one of those small operations that runs every October. I was in high school then, working the weekends for extra cash and, honestly, just for the fun of it. Scaring people was easy, and the screams and laughter felt like rewards for a job well done. That night started out normal. The guests came in waves, shuffling nervously down the narrow dirt path lined with fake gravestones and rubber bats. I'd perfected my timing by then. Wait until they were just about to pass the crypt, step out from the fog, and let out a blood-curdling growl. The reactions were always worth it. Some people screamed, some jumped, and there was always one person who clutched at their friend, swearing they totally weren't scared. But everything changed about halfway through the night, and it wasn't a guest who caused it. It was one of us, the chainsaw guy. His name was Todd, a senior who was cocky in that way only teenage boys with motorized tools can be. He was stationed near the last stop on the trail, his job to rev the engine and chase the groups out with that classic scream-inducing sound. Of course, the chainsaw didn't have a blade. That'd be insane, but it worked like a charm. Todd loved it. He'd lean into the act, muttering creepy lines under his breath before revving the saw and sending guests running. I heard the screams first, high-pitched, raw, and completely out of place. They weren't the playful screams of scared guests. They were the kind of screams that hit you in the chest and make your stomach drop. I froze for half a second, heart pounding, before snapping out of it and running toward the sound. When I got there, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Todd was on the ground, rolling and flailing, his arm engulfed in flames. The chainsaw was lying a few feet away, abandoned and still. His screams cut through the night, mixing with the shouts of other workers running to help. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned, my brain struggling to catch up with what I was looking at. "Get water!" someone yelled, snapping me out of it. I turned and sprinted toward the nearest prop bucket, dumping out the fake blood and filling it with water from the fog machine's hose. By the time I got back, someone had grabbed a heavy coat and was using it to smother the flames on Todd's arm. The fire was out, but his skin was blistered and raw. Patches of it burned black. He was crying now, loud guttural sobs as he rocked back and forth on the ground. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. One of the other workers, still pale and wide-eyed, shook his head. He used a lighter. I stared at him, confused. "What?" "His chainsaw ran out of gas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't see what he was doing, so he used a lighter to pour the gas. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Todd hadn't bothered to grab a flashlight. He'd flicked on a lighter, and the fumes from the gas tank had ignited. It was such a stupid, avoidable mistake. And now he was sitting there, burned and broken, while the rest of us scrambled to figure out what to do. Someone had already called 911, and within minutes, the paramedics arrived. They loaded Todd onto a stretcher, his face pale and slick with sweat. He winced as they wrapped his arm, his breathing shallow and ragged. The rest of us stood there, silent and shaken, watching as the ambulance's lights faded into the distance. We didn't open the trail again that night. The guests who'd been waiting were sent home with refunds, and the rest of us were left to clean up the mess. I remember crouching near Todd's chainsaw, picking it up carefully as if it still held some kind of danger. The smell of burned flesh lingered in the air, mixing with the gasoline and the fake fog. It was the kind of smell that sticks with you, no matter how hard you try to forget it. Todd ended up being okay, at least physically. His burns were severe but treatable, and after a few months of recovery, he was back at school, bragging about his battle scars like it was some kind of badge of honor. But he never worked the haunted trail again. None of us blamed him. Honestly, none of us wanted to go near that chainsaw after what happened. Story 3. It wasn't until I lived there that I understood how heavy silence could be. The house wasn't anything fancy. A rental in a quiet neighborhood, a bit worn down but perfectly livable. The previous owner had left suddenly after his wife passed away, and along with the house, he left behind most of their furniture. My first thought was that it was convenient, less stuff for me to worry about, but something about that detail stuck with me. Why leave it all behind? Why not sell it or at least take the sentimental pieces? One of those pieces was a rocking chair, solid wood, polished to a faint shine. It sat in the corner of the living room with a matching rocking leg rest, both positioned like they were waiting for someone to use them. I didn't mind it at first, thought it was a nice touch even. My roommate joked that it gave the house character, but over time the chair started to feel different. I'm not one for believing in haunted houses or lingering spirits, so when little things started happening, I chalked it up to my imagination. The chair would be slightly angled in the morning after I swore I'd seen it perfectly straight the night before, or I'd hear the faintest creak from the living room when I was upstairs. But it was an old house. It was bound to make noise. Still, I avoided sitting in it, almost like instinct. It wasn't until one night after midnight that everything changed. I'd been working late, and by the time I got home, my stomach was begging for a snack. My roommate was already asleep, so I crept downstairs, keeping the lights off to avoid waking him. The glow of the moon coming through the blinds lit the living room enough to navigate without flipping the switch. The rocking chair was right there in its usual spot, unmoving, just part of the room. I made my way toward the kitchen, my mind entirely focused on the bag of chips waiting for me in the cabinet. But halfway through the room, I stopped. Not because of anything I saw, at least not at first, but because of a sound, the faint, rhythmic creak of wood. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening even though I had no idea why yet. It wasn't loud, wasn't alarming, just faint enough to make me question whether I was hearing it at all. But when I looked at the corner, my heart sank. The rocking chair was moving, back and forth, steady as could be, and the leg rest, perfectly in sync. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter behind me. For a split second, I told myself it had to be the wind. The windows weren't open, but maybe there was a draft, or maybe vibrations from the floor. But as I stood there, watching the chair and the leg rest rock like someone was sitting in them, I knew none of those explanations made sense. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. It was ridiculous. I knew I was alone. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and my roommate would have been snoring upstairs. But I couldn't keep the words from slipping out. No reply, just the rhythmic creak of the chair. I took a step closer, my legs feeling like lead. My breath came shallow as my brain fought to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it really moving? Was I imagining it? Every logical thought I had fell apart as the chair kept rocking, indifferent to my presence, and then it stopped. Not suddenly. No, that would have been less eerie. It just slowed down, one gentle rock at a time, until it was still again. It was almost deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was using it had decided to leave. I didn't touch the chair. I didn't step closer. I didn't grab my snack. I turned around, bolted upstairs, and locked the bedroom door behind me. My roommate asked me the next morning why I looked so pale. I told him I didn't sleep well. I didn't tell him why. It wasn't the last time the chair moved, but it was the most vivid. After that night, I kept my distance, avoided the living room unless the lights were on and someone else was there. My roommate started noticing it too. The way it creaked softly when no one was sitting in it. The way it seemed angled differently when we came back home from errands. But neither of us said much about it. What could we say? When we moved out at the end of the lease, we didn't take the chair with us. It stayed exactly where we found it, perfectly still in the corner of the living room. I don't know if the next tenant ever noticed anything unusual. Maybe they thought nothing of it, just an old piece of furniture. Maybe they sat in it. I hope they didn't. Story 4. We moved into the house after my parents divorced. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old creaky place with thin walls and a draft that you could feel even when the windows were shut tight. Money was tight, so my dad was firm about keeping the electric bill low. Every light, every device had to be switched off unless it was absolutely necessary. I got lectured about it more times than I could count. Most mornings I'd wait for my ride to school in the living room. I liked standing by the window, watching the empty street as the sun crept up. The house always felt too quiet then, especially when Dad was still asleep. But one morning as I stood there, I heard something that wasn't quiet at all. It started faint, muffled, like the sound of someone talking in another room. At first I thought the TV was on, which would have been weird, considering how strict Dad was about turning it off. I walked over and pressed the power button. Instead of shutting off, the TV powered on, the screen lighting up with a soft glow. My stomach sank. Okay, not the TV. Then what? The sound was still there. A woman's voice, distant and calm, like she was having a casual conversation. I checked the phone, thinking maybe it was left off the hook. Number, the radios? Nothing. Every electronic device in the house was off. By then, my heart was starting to race, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always was, right? I stood still, trying to focus on where the voice was coming from. It seemed to shift, almost like it was moving as I listened. It started on the far side of the room, but when I stepped closer, it seemed to float behind me, as if it were coming from the other side now. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but I caught fragments, something about needles and materials, like she was talking about sewing. Her tone was so casual, so mundane, that it somehow made the whole thing even more unsettling. That's when it hit me. There wasn't a logical explanation. The house was empty. It was just me. No TV, no phone, no radio. Just me and her. My hair stood on end, a chill spreading down my spine. It was that moment, the one where your gut tells you something isn't right. I bolted, didn't even think about it. I just grabbed my bag, ran out the door, and waited for my ride at the curb. The house could have itself for all I cared. When I got home later that day, I told my dad what happened, hoping for some kind of reassurance. Maybe he'd explain it away, laugh at how ridiculous I was being, but instead he got quiet, too quiet. Finally he said, "I've heard her too." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes, in the mornings, when I'm working out, I hear a woman's voice. Sounds distant, like she's talking to someone in another room. I didn't want to tell you because..." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't want you to feel scared, being here alone." I stared at him, waiting for him to say more, to offer some kind of explanation. He didn't. Just left it hanging there, as though it was something we'd both have to live with. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that house. I'd hear faint whispers now and then, but I never tried to pinpoint them again. I didn't want to know where they were coming from, and when we finally moved out a year later, I didn't look back. Some things are better left unanswered. Story 5. Working at a haunted trail, you learn to stay ready for anything. People react to fear in all kinds of ways. Screaming, laughing, running, freezing. But nothing could have prepared me for this one night. I still think about it every October when the trails reopen. And let me tell you, I've never seen anything like it since. It was a busy Friday night. The air was cool, the leaves crunching underfoot as group after group made their way through the winding, dimly lit path. I was stationed in a shadowy corner near the end of the trail, where the path narrowed into a tight hallway covered by a thick black curtain. My job was simple: wait for people to come close, crawl out from the dark, and scare the life out of them. Classic stuff. I'd gotten pretty good at it over the season, timing my moves just right to get the loudest shrieks. That night, as I crouched down waiting for my next group, I spotted something different. A person in a wheelchair, being pushed through the trail by someone behind them. The wheelchair glinted under the flickering lights, and the two figures moved cautiously through the narrow path. My first instinct was to hold back. I didn't want to startle someone in a wheelchair too much. What if it scared them in a way that wasn't fun? But as they got closer, I noticed the person sitting in the wheelchair seemed alert, smiling even, like they were enjoying themselves. Then I thought, man, if I came to a haunted house in a wheelchair, I wouldn't want to miss out on the scares just because of it. So I made a decision. I waited until they passed me, staying completely still. The person in the wheelchair didn't even glance my way. The one pushing them, too focused on maneuvering to notice me crouched in the shadows. When they were a few steps ahead, I slowly crawled forward across the floor, quiet as I could. I could feel the excitement building, that perfect moment where I'd leap out and yell, catching them completely off guard. And then I did. I jumped up, arms out, and let out a loud, guttural scream. Rah! The reaction was unexpected. The person in the wheelchair turned their head, raised an eyebrow, and gave me the most sarcastic look I'd ever seen. It wasn't fear, not even close. It was pure, really? That's what you've got? Their expression said everything they didn't need to say out loud. For a second, I almost laughed at how unimpressed they were. But the person pushing the wheelchair? That was a whole different story. Without a second of hesitation, they let out a scream and bolted. I mean, bolted. They grabbed the handles of the wheelchair and pushed it forward at top speed, sprinting toward the curtain at the end of the hallway. I barely had time to react, my hands going up as if to say, "Wait, stop." They tore through the curtain like it wasn't even there, the thick fabric flapping behind them. But here's the thing about that curtain. The hallway doesn't go straight past it. It takes a sharp turn to the left, something you'd only know if you'd already gone through before. They didn't know. From where I stood, I heard the sickening thud as the wheelchair slammed straight into the wall at the dead end. The sound echoed back through the hallway, followed by a yelp and some muffled shouts. My stomach dropped. "Oh no," I muttered, already running to help. By the time I got to the curtain, they were gone. The wheelchair, the person pushing it, both of them had disappeared as if they'd never been there at all. I stared down the empty hallway, half expecting to find them lying in a heap on the floor, but there was nothing, just silence. I don't know how they got out so fast or where they went, but I spent the rest of my shift feeling equal parts guilty and bewildered. Did they make it through the rest of the trail? Did they leave right after? And most importantly, was everyone okay? I never found out. They didn't come back to complain or file an incident report, and I didn't see them again that night. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that sarcastic glance from the person in the wheelchair and the pure, unfiltered panic of the person pushing them. It's the kind of story that makes you laugh and cringe all at once, and a reminder that when it comes to haunted trails, you've got to be ready for literally anything. Story 6. Didn't work in a haunted house, but I lived in one for sure. I wasn't looking for an adventure when I moved into that apartment. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a cozy place to share with two close friends. The rent was cheap, the location ideal, and the old creaky building had a certain charm that made it feel like home. None of us could have imagined what we were signing up for. At first, things were normal. We settled in, divided up the space, and started decorating the place with mismatched furniture and random knickknacks. The guy in our group, let's call him Sam, was a skeptic to his core. He didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything remotely paranormal. My best friend Kate and I, we weren't necessarily believers, but we weren't ruling it all out either. The idea of a haunted house was something we joked about, not something we expected. But then the noises started. It was subtle at first. I'd be lying in bed at night, reading or scrolling through my phone, when I'd hear faint tapping sounds coming from Kate's side of the wall. They weren't loud, just enough to make me pause and wonder if she was awake and moving around. After a few nights, I brought it up casually over breakfast. "Hey, do you hear knocking at night? Like from your room?" Kate looked at me confused. "No? What kind of knocking?" I shrugged, brushing it off. Maybe it was just the pipes or the old walls settling, but the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more distinct. When we finally decided to investigate, we traced the knocking to the bottles Kate kept on a shelf in her room, wine bottles, perfume bottles, random containers she hadn't unpacked. They were shaking by themselves. Kate stared at them, wide-eyed. "Okay," she said, her voice tense. "That's weird." We tried to rationalize it. Maybe vibrations from outside, maybe air pressure. But neither explanation made sense. The bottles weren't lined up in a way that would allow them to wobble, and there was no draft or movement to set them off. It was just happening. Then it got worse. Kate started noticing her clothes weren't where she left them. A sweater she swore she'd hung in her closet ended up folded neatly on my desk. A pair of shoes were found under my bed, even though we'd been out together all day and no one had been home. She laughed it off at first, calling herself forgetful, but the pattern was unmistakable. Her things were moving, teleporting, almost, into my room without explanation. Sam rolled his eyes every time we brought it up. "You're overthinking," he said. "Stuff gets misplaced all the time." Neither Kate nor I pushed it. What was the point? He wouldn't believe us no matter how strange things got. Then came the week Kate went on holiday. She'd planned a trip out of town with her family, leaving me alone in the apartment for the first time. I wasn't worried about it. I actually looked forward to the quiet. But the first night, I didn't sleep. I was lying in bed, lights off, trying to drift off when I heard the keys. My keys, the ones hanging on the door, shaking. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I got up to check, there was no movement anywhere else. Just my keys, rattling as if someone were fiddling with them from the other side. I sat frozen, staring at the door, heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but the tension hung in the air. When I finally mustered the courage to examine them in the morning, I found something that sent chills down my spine. The strap of my keys, a short, sturdy piece of leather, about 5 centimeters long, had been tightly and perfectly wrapped around the keyring. It wasn't something I could have done accidentally. It wasn't something that could have happened naturally. That day, everything came to a head. The black mass appeared in the corridor. I was making my way from the kitchen to the living room when I saw it. A dark, shapeless figure hovering near the far end of the hallway. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't entirely transparent either. I froze, staring at it, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the mass lingered there, silent and unmoving. And then, as if to break the spell, the sound of the bathtub curtain echoed through the apartment. The metal rings rattled along the pipe, shifting and creaking as though someone were pulling it back and forth. I didn't go to check. I couldn't. I felt my chest tighten, my breath shorten, and the walls seemed to close in on me. I barely made it to my room before the panic hit full force. I called Kate that afternoon, tears in my voice. "I can't stay here alone," I told her. "Please come back." She cut her trip short and arrived the next day. Her presence helped, but the unease never truly left. My dad called a medium and arranged for a spiritual cleanse. The medium, a calm, stoic woman, walked through the apartment, muttering prayers and lighting incense. She didn't say much, but when she left, she told us to keep the space light and positive. We took her advice, playing music and opening windows, anything to keep the heaviness away. I don't know if the cleanse worked completely, but the strange occurrences lessened after that. The knocking stopped. The clothes stayed where they were supposed to, and the black mass never returned. Story 7. Working as a lead at Universal's Halloween Horror Nights taught me one thing. No 2 nights are ever the same. Some nights were just chaos. Guests screaming in terror, scare actors jumping from one dark corner to another, and the air thick with adrenaline and fog machine haze. But others were darker. That place had a pulse, and it wasn't always from the crowds. There's one night I can't shake from memory. I'd been walking the perimeter of a maze near one of the original sound stages. This particular maze was notorious for how disorienting it was. Tight corridors, strobe lights, mirrors, even sound effects designed to mess with your head. People came out dazed, clutching their friends, or stumbling like they'd walked off a carnival ride. It was close to midnight, and the usual chaos of horror nights was in full swing. My radio crackled with updates from other leads as we worked to keep things moving smoothly. But as I rounded a corner near the entrance to the maze, I noticed a guy leaning against the wall. He wasn't just catching his breath. He looked off, pale, sweaty, his eyes darting around like he was somewhere else entirely. I stepped closer, trying not to spook him. "Hey, you good?" I asked. No response. He blinked at me, but it was like he was looking through me. I tried again. "Sir, do you need water? Do you need to sit down?" He finally muttered something, but it was incoherent, like his words were stuck in his throat. Then suddenly his knees buckled and he hit the ground hard. "Code red," I said into my radio, my voice sharper than I intended. Within seconds, security and first aid were sprinting toward us. By the time they reached him, he was unconscious, barely breathing. We found out later he'd overdosed. Too many pills mixed with alcohol, plus dehydration. The paramedics got him stable, but for a moment, I really thought he might not make it. It shook me. I'd seen people faint from fear, hyperventilate, or even just get too drunk to walk. But this was different. It was real in a way the mazes could never be. That wasn't the end of the night, though. After the paramedics wheeled him away, I headed back into the maze to check on the scare actors. They were shaken but still in character, jumping out at guests and screaming like nothing had happened. That's the thing about horror nights. It doesn't stop. The show goes on. As I walked through the maze, I caught myself pausing in the soundstage's dark corners. There's something about those old buildings. They've been around for a century and you can feel it. The echoes of everything that's happened there seem to linger. In the quieter moments, when the crowds aren't so loud, you can almost hear the place breathing. That night, I swear I heard something else. A faint bell-like noise. Just a soft chime, coming from somewhere deep in the soundstage. It wasn't part of the maze. I knew every sound effect, every track, and this wasn't one of them. I froze listening, my pulse quickening as the bell chimed again, faint but clear. I turned toward the sound, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the flickering strobes and distant screams of guests. I radioed to see if anyone else had heard it, but the responses were casual, dismissive. "Probably one of the soundtracks looping," someone said. But I knew better. The soundstage was old. Hundreds of movies and shows had been filmed there, and I'd heard all the rumors. People talked about shadows that moved where they shouldn't, cold spots that lingered no matter how many bodies filled the space, whispers that came from nowhere. I always shrugged it off until that night. The bell chimed one last time, faint and distant, before falling silent. I stood there for a long moment, waiting, before shaking it off and heading back to the control booth. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted, the adrenaline of the overdose and the strange chimes still gnawing at the edge of my thoughts. When I locked up and walked out of the park, the studio lot felt eerie, like the silence was louder than it should have been. Working at Halloween Horror Nights wasn't just about scaring people. Sometimes it felt like the place itself was alive, feeding off the energy we brought in every night. And sometimes it reminded you that not all the ghosts were part of the show. Story 8. It was my second October working at the Haunted Trail, buried deep in the woods of North Carolina. The place was designed to scare the living daylights out of anyone who dared to walk through, and for the most part, it delivered. Animatronics, fog machines, chainsaw scares. Every corner was crafted to hit some deep, primal fear. But there was one section of the trail that always got people. The body bag room. Picture this. A dimly lit section of the trail filled with hanging black bags. Most of them contained mannequins. Dead weight suspended from hooks that swayed just slightly in the breeze. But one bag had a person inside. That was Caleb's job. He was our designated body bag jumper, and he took his role seriously. He'd wait until the guests were at just the right spot, then burst out of the bag screaming bloody murder and sending people scattering. He got screams every time, and on the rare occasion he didn't, his sheer commitment still left people unnerved. One night, though, things got a little too real. It was late, past 11, and the groups coming through were getting rowdier. That's always how it went. The later it got, the drunker people became. There was this one group, maybe 5 or 6 people, who were visibly wasted. They stumbled into the body bag room, laughing too loud and leaning on each other for support. You could smell the mix of booze and weed on them even before they spoke. Caleb and I exchanged a glance. "Your call," I whispered, knowing he was debating whether to go full throttle with the scare. Sometimes drunk groups weren't worth the risk. They could get aggressive, or worse, violent. He nodded, waiting in silence as the group wove between the hanging bags, pushing at them like kids trying to find a piñata. They were joking about how fake everything looked, daring each other to touch the bags. Caleb timed it perfectly. Just as one guy reached out to prod the bag he was hiding in, he erupted from it, screaming at the top of his lungs. The reaction was instant and chaotic. One girl shrieked and bolted, disappearing into the darkness of the next section. A guy stumbled backward, tripping over one of his friends and landing flat on his back. But the rest of the group, they lost it. Not in a scared way, though. They turned on Caleb. "What the hell, man?" one guy shouted, his voice slurring. Another one lunged at Caleb, fists raised, shouting something incoherent. Caleb ducked and scrambled out of the bag, putting the hanging mannequins between him and the group. "Back off," I yelled, stepping in from the shadows. "No touching the actors!" The guy closest to Caleb glared at me, swaying slightly. "This isn't funny," he slurred. "It's not funny." "Then leave," I snapped, my heart pounding. My voice didn't betray how unnerved I was, but I was already scanning for an escape route in case things got worse. Before they could respond, a new sound cut through the tension. Scratching. Faint at first, then louder, coming from the wall behind us. It wasn't part of the trail, and it wasn't anything we'd set up. Caleb froze, his eyes meeting mine, his expression shifting from annoyed to something else. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, like claws dragging across wood. "Is that you?" one of the drunk guys asked, suddenly less aggressive. "No," Caleb said, his voice low. "It's not." The room fell silent except for the steady scrape of the sound. Even the drunk group stopped, their bravado evaporating as they looked around. The scratching moved, literally moved from one end of the wall to the other, and then stopped. Then came the growl. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, guttural, the kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. It came from somewhere behind the wall, in the crawl space where props and spare equipment were stored. I knew that space. It was cramped, barely big enough for a person to crouch in, and it was empty, supposedly. "Okay, what the actual hell?" Caleb muttered, stepping back toward me. The drunk group stood frozen, their earlier aggression replaced by wide-eyed fear. I pulled out my walkie. "We need to check on the body bag room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got something." The line crackled, but no one responded. The scratching started again, faster this time, like it was moving toward us. Caleb grabbed my arm. "We're leaving," he whispered. I nodded, not needing to be told twice. "All right, folks, this part of the trail's closed," I said, ushering the group forward. "Move along." They didn't argue. They practically tripped over each other to get out, casting nervous glances back at the wall. Caleb and I hung back, waiting until they were out of sight before turning to face the wall again. The growl came one last time, low and deliberate, almost like it was mocking us. We didn't stick around to find out what it was. We shut the room down for the night and avoided the crawl space for the rest of the season. Whatever it wasn't part of the act. And to this day, I can't explain it. All I know is that some scares aren't scripted. Some things just don't belong, and you know it the moment you hear them. Story 9. I am scared to work in a haunted house because of an experience I had when I was younger. When I think about that house, it always feels distant, like a memory from someone else's life rather than my own. I was only 4 when we lived there, just old enough to remember flashes of the place, but not old enough to understand the weight of what happened. My parents insist the story is true, and my brothers do too, though to this day it makes them uneasy to talk about it. Even now, I still get chills when I think about what they told me. It was an old farmhouse tucked away at the end of a gravel road surrounded by fields that stretched on forever. My 2 older brothers shared the upstairs bedroom, while I stayed downstairs with my parents. At 4, I didn't think much about the creaks and groans of an old house. It was just the way things were. A drafty window here, the wind rattling the walls there. But for my brothers, it wasn't just the house settling. They started complaining about the window in their room. At first, my parents brushed it off, saying they probably hadn't latched it properly before going to bed. But my brothers swore up and down that the window was opening on its own, flying open in the dead of night with a loud crash that jolted them awake. My dad went up to check it, tightening the latch, and told them to stop worrying. But then it happened again, and again. And it wasn't just the window. The door to their room, solid wood, heavy, and prone to sticking, would creak open and then slam shut on its own. At first, my parents thought my brothers were pranking them, maybe trying to scare each other and then blaming the house. My mom even suggested that the draft from the window was causing the door to move, though none of that explained what came next. One night, my parents were jolted awake by my brothers screaming. It wasn't the usual kind of shout you'd hear from kids having a nightmare. This was pure panic, raw and unfiltered. My dad shot out of bed, my mom close behind him, but before they could even get to the stairs, they heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footfalls creaking along the landing upstairs, crossing from my brother's room toward the staircase. My dad froze for a second, listening, thinking maybe one of my brothers was running out of the room. But the steps didn't sound hurried. They didn't sound like a child. They sounded heavy, like boots on old wood. "Stay here," he told my mom, then headed for the stairs. By the time he got there, the footsteps had reached the bottom step and stopped. My dad flipped the lights on, scanning the empty living room below. There was nothing, no one. The house was silent again, except for my brother's muffled sobs upstairs. This wasn't a one-time thing. It kept happening, night after night. The window would fly open, the door would slam, and then the footsteps would start, crossing the landing, heading down the stairs, always stopping at the very bottom. My parents tried everything they could think of. My dad nailed the window shut, put a heavy chair in front of the door, even stayed up late sitting at the bottom of the stairs to catch whoever or whatever was making the noise. But the footsteps never came when he was awake, only when he was asleep. The worst part, though, the nights when I'd wake up downstairs and hear it too. I didn't understand much at that age, but I knew the sound of footsteps. I'd lie in my little bed, clutching my blanket, listening as the creaking started upstairs and made its way toward the stairs. I'd hold my breath, waiting for someone to walk into the living room, but no one ever did. The footsteps always stopped right at the bottom step, like whoever was walking decided not to come any closer. We didn't stay in that house long. My parents never said why we moved. They just said they wanted something newer, something closer to town. My brothers stopped talking about what happened, but I could see the unease in their faces anytime the house came up. My dad, to this day, gets a strange look in his eyes when he talks about it, like he's remembering something he's tried hard to forget. Story 10, Six Flags during Fright Fest was my playground. As a walk-around scarecrow, I made it my mission to haunt the park, creeping people out just enough to send chills down their spines. I relished in the screams, the laughter, and the thrill of bringing the night to life. My costume, patched with straw and smeared with dirt, left no question. I was terrifying. It wasn't just the guests who got scared, though. That one night, I learned fear in a way I'd never known before. It was a crisp October evening, and the park was buzzing with its usual energy. Fog machines were churning out eerie clouds, pumpkins lit every corner, and distant screams echoed from roller coasters and haunted mazes. My shift had just started, and I was ready to prowl. Not 20 minutes in, as I was skulking along the edge of one of the darker sections of the park, I noticed a few high school kids duck into one of the park's older, less used buildings. I hesitated. The building wasn't on the official trail, but curious guests sometimes slipped away to explore spots they weren't supposed to. These kids were laughing nervously, probably just looking for a quiet place to regroup or prank one another. Still, I decided to check on them. I stayed in character, my boots scraping the ground as I made my way inside, my voice raspy as I muttered, "Where are you hiding?" The inside was dim, just enough light spilling in from a cracked window to illuminate the dust-covered floor. It had a stale, forgotten smell, like no one had stepped inside in years. As I ventured further, I heard faint whispers and shuffling. "Found you!" I growled, more for effect than anything else. The room I entered was small, furnished only with an old bunk bed against one wall. The kids were sitting on the top bunk, huddled together, their faces pale but smiling nervously. They looked like they'd been caught sneaking into a forbidden attic or a neighbor's shed. I took a step closer, ready to drop into a crouch or lunge to give them a good scare. But then I froze. My attention snapped to the far corner of the room. That's when I saw them. Two shadowy figures leaning over the kids. They weren't part of the group. They weren't human at all. I couldn't make out faces or features, just dark, shapeless forms, like living shadows. Their movements weren't fluid but jagged, like static on an old television. And as I stepped forward, they turned to face me. My scream wasn't planned. It tore out of me before I could think. Pure instinct. Fight or flight kicked in hard. But instead of running, I charged toward the kids on the bunk, desperate to get them out of there. The figures didn't move, didn't retreat. They just stood there watching as I grabbed the first kid by the arm and practically dragged them off the bed. The others scrambled to follow, clinging to me and one another as we bolted out of the room. The air outside hit me like a slap to the face, cool and sharp compared to the suffocating stillness inside. My heart was racing, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The kids were wide-eyed, babbling incoherent questions. What was that? Who were they? Did you see it too? But I couldn't answer. I didn't have words for what I'd just seen. We didn't stop running until we were back in the crowded main section of the park. The kids disappeared into the throngs of guests, too shaken to look back. I stood there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, I couldn't shake the image of those shadows, or the cold, palpable fear they left behind. I didn't go back to that building for the rest of the season. I didn't tell my coworkers about it either. What could I even say? Terrifying guess was my job, but that night I learned what it felt like to be the one running for my life. And it's a fear I'll never forget. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.